Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The boy learned early that wood remembers everything. A careless cut, an impatient chisel stroke, a joint forced against the grain, the timber would carry those mistakes forever, whispering them back through creaks and splits when the vessel met rough water. His mother told him this the morning she took him to the shipyard, her hands still red from washing linens in cold river water since before dawn. The master carpenter stood in the doorway of his workshop, sawdust clinging to his leather apron like snow that refused to melt. He looked at the boy's hands, small still, but already calloused from carrying water buckets and splitting kindling. A brief nod, nothing more. The transaction had been arranged weeks before, payment made in laundered shirts and mended trousers, in favors owed and collected across the working districts that pressed against Savannah's prosperous squares like supplicants at a gate. The shipyard smelled of pitch and possibility. Oak shavings curled beneath the planes like ribbon. Pine tar bubbled in iron pots, sending up sweet, acrid smoke that caught in the throat. The boy watched grown men transform rough timber into curves that would carry cargo across oceans he could barely imagine. They moved with certainty, their hammers finding nails with rhythmic precision, their saws singing through planks in long, purposeful strokes. He swept floors first. For months, nothing but sweeping, until he understood that even this had meaning. Learning which woods made which shavings, how fresh-cut cypress smelled different from aged oak, how to read the day's work by what accumulated beneath the benches. The other apprentices, boys a year or two older, explained the hierarchy in whispers during the brief midday break. The master's word was law. Questions were answered with demonstration, rarely with patience. Mistakes were remembered long after they were corrected. Winter brought different lessons. The boy learned that cold made wood brittle, that hands too numb couldn't feel the grain, that a good carpenter arrived early to warm his tools near the fire. He learned to identify timber by touch in dim light, the tight grain of white oak for frames, the straight clarity of longleaf pine for masts, the rot-resistant heart of cedar for planking below the waterline. His first real task came on a spring morning when he'd been there nearly 2 years. The master handed him a draw knife and pointed to a pile of rough-cut oak. Strip the bark, follow the cambium layer, don't dig into the heartwood. The boy worked until his shoulders burned and his palms bled through the calluses he thought he'd already earned. When he finished, The master ran his hand along the stripped timber, feeling for gouges. Another nod. Nothing more was needed. The harbor became his second home, more familiar than the cramped room he shared with his mother above the laundry. He knew the merchant vessels by silhouette, could identify a schooner's lines in fog, understood which captains maintained their ships and which let them rot between profitable runs. The dock workers, black men mostly, some freed, some hired out by owners who collected their wages, moved cargo with an efficiency that looked like chaos until you watched long enough to see the pattern. At 14, he was allowed to assist with actual repairs, holding boards in place while the journeyman fastened them, mixing oakum and tar for caulking, learning to read a hull's condition by the sound his mallet made against the planking. A dull thud meant rot beneath. A clean ring meant solid wood, years of service left. He developed an ear for these subtle differences, a sense for what a ship was telling him through vibrations in his fingertips. Money came slowly. His mother still washed linens, though less now, saving her hands for mending work that paid better. He gave her most of his apprentice wages, copper coins that felt significant in his palm, meaningless against the cost of rent and food. But there was always a penny or two set aside, dropped into a tin, hidden behind a loose brick. Someday money for his own tools, someday enough to choose his work rather than beg for it. The master rarely praised, but he taught constantly. How to select timber at the lumber yard, feeling for density, and checking the cut ends for the tight rings that meant slow growth and strength. How to read plans drawn by naval architects who'd never held a saw, translating their elegant lines into the practical reality of joinery and fastenings. How to calculate the curve of a ship's ribs using nothing but string and intuition, centuries of accumulated knowledge passing through demonstration rather than words. By 16, he could rebuild a ship's side from frames to planking, could fashion a replacement spar that matched its twin so perfectly no eye could tell the difference. His hands had become instruments of precision, capable of feeling variations in wood texture too subtle for most men to notice. The other apprentices had moved on or fallen away, replaced by younger boys who swept floors and watched with the same hungry attention he'd once brought to every task. The master grew older, his movements stiffer each winter, though his standards never softened. There were mornings when the boy, no longer quite a boy, arrived to find the workshop cold, the master not yet present. He'd start the fire, lay out tools, begin preliminary work on whatever project waited. A silent understanding developed. The master noticed, said nothing, but began trusting him with more complex tasks. His 17th year brought the first stirring of something beyond mere survival. Walking past the merchants' houses on the squares, he noticed their proportions, their details, the craftsmanship in their doorways and window frames. Not envy exactly, but a growing awareness of the distance between those who worked with their hands and those who profited from that work. The ship captains treated him with casual respect, recognizing skilled labor when they saw it. The ship owners barely looked at him, their eyes sliding past as if he were another tool in the workshop, useful but interchangeable. Still, there was satisfaction in the work itself. A vessel he'd helped repair would slide down the ways into the Savannah River, settling into the water with a rightness that came from proper construction. Months later, it would return from Charleston, or the Indies, or ports he'd only heard named, still sound, still serving. His work carried people and cargo across distances he might never travel. There was a kind of pride in that, quiet and uncelebrated, but real nonetheless. The master called him over one evening as the light failed, and the other workers headed toward the taverns and boarding houses. He opened a wooden chest and removed a set of tools, planes, chisels, a fine-toothed saw with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. These had been his master's tools, inherited from the man who'd taught him. He placed them in the boy's hands without ceremony, without explanation. The weight of them, the balance, the sense of responsibility they carried. It was graduation and burden at once, welcome and terrifying in equal measure. That night, walking home through streets lit by oil lamps and the occasional gaslights that marked Savannah's tentative modernization, he understood that his apprenticeship was ending. Soon he'd need to find his own way, establish his own reputation, navigate the complicated waters between craft and commerce. The tools under his arm felt heavier with each step, pulling him forward into whatever came next. Freedom felt like hunger at first. Working for himself meant finding his own clients, negotiating his own prices, carrying the weight of reputation without the master's name to shield him. The workshop he rented, barely more than a shed near the eastern wharves, leaked when it rained and baked like an oven through Savannah's summer months. But the tools hanging on his wall were his own, and the work that came through the door was his to accept or refuse. The first commissions were small: patching a fishing boat's worn planking, replacing oarlocks on a river barge, straightening a skiff's twisted keel. Work that established craftsmen considered beneath their attention, but that kept coins flowing into his pocket. He learned to estimate jobs carefully, calculating not just materials and time, but the invisible costs. A client who paid late, a repair that revealed deeper problems, the days when weather made outdoor work impossible. His former master had taught him to read wood. Now he was learning to read people. The merchant who inspected every joint with suspicious eyes usually paid promptly and recommended others. The affable captain who praised everything and promised future work often disappeared when the bill came due. The shipping agents who acted as intermediaries took their percentage and expected gratitude for the privilege of access to larger contracts. She appeared at his workshop on a Tuesday morning, carrying a basket of cornbread still warm from baking. The provision shop she ran with her mother stood 3 streets over, supplying sailors and dock workers with the necessities that kept ships functioning: rope, canvas, dried meat, ship's biscuit that could survive months at sea. Her husband had been a cooper, she explained, lost to yellow fever 2 summers past. She had noticed his workshop, seen the quality of his repairs, thought he might appreciate fresh bread in exchange for fixing the shelving in her storeroom. The arrangement was practical, nothing more at first. He repaired her shelves, reinforced her counter, built proper storage for the heavy coils of rope that had been piled haphazardly in corners. She brought bread, sometimes stew, occasionally information about which captains were looking for repair work, which ships had just made port with damage that needed addressing. Her presence in the workshop felt natural, like the smell of wood shavings or the rasp of a saw finding its rhythm. Savannah's harbor was expanding, pushing outward as cotton wealth flowed through the port. New wharves extended into the river, warehouses multiplied along the waterfront, and vessels grew larger to accommodate the endless bales of white fiber that had become the city's lifeblood. For a skilled carpenter willing to work hard, there was more opportunity than time. He found himself turning down small jobs to focus on substantial repairs, replacing entire sections of hull, rebuilding deck structures, even designing custom fittings for wealthy merchants who wanted their vessels to reflect their prosperity. His reputation grew through the wordless language of the waterfront. Captains noticed which repairs lasted and which failed when the first storm hit. Dock workers saw which craftsmen showed up when promised and which made excuses. Insurance assessors, those careful men who inspected vessels and calculated risk, began mentioning his name when ship owners asked for recommendations. This invisible network of professional respect was worth more than any advertisement, though it came with its own demands. There were expectations now. A captain who'd hired him once assumed availability the next time. A shipping agent who'd directed business his way expected priority treatment and favorable rates. He learned to navigate these obligations carefully, maintaining relationships without becoming beholden, providing quality work without underselling his skills. It was a different kind of craftsmanship. This management of reputation and relationships, less satisfying than shaping wood, but equally necessary. The provision seller began staying longer after delivering bread, watching him work, asking questions about ships and timber and the endless varieties of marine construction. She had a practical mind that understood business, could calculate profit margins faster than he could, noticed patterns in harbor activity that predicted which supplies would be needed next. Her husband had taught her to see commerce as a kind of craft, requiring attention and skill, just like carpentry. Evening walks became routine. After the workshop closed and her shop shuttered for the night, they'd walk along Bay Street, watching the sun set over the river, the water turning copper and gold. He talked about wood and vessels. She talked about her daughter, 9 years old, helping in the shop after school, learning to keep accounts and manage inventory. Neither spoke of courtship directly, but intentions shaped themselves through these quiet hours, through shared meals and practical assistance, through the comfortable silence that came from understanding each other's work. His savings accumulated in a metal box, hidden beneath his workshop floorboards. Not wealth by any merchant's measure, but enough to imagine possibilities that had seemed absurd during apprenticeship. Perhaps a larger workshop. Perhaps a house that didn't leak. Perhaps a family of his own. Though the thought carried complicated weight, responsibility and joy mixed together like oakum and tar. The schooner commission changed everything. A Charleston merchant needed extensive repairs after his vessel struck a submerged log in the river. The damage was substantial. 3 frames cracked, planking stove in along a 6-foot section, the keel requiring inspection and possible reinforcement. It was the kind of work that could make a reputation or destroy it, complicated enough to showcase skill, but risky enough to ruin a craftsman if done poorly. He spent 2 days just examining the damage, making drawings, calculating materials and time. The merchant was impatient, wanted quick answers and faster work. But rushing would guarantee failure, and failure on a project this visible would echo through the waterfront for years. He gave his estimate, higher than the merchant expected, longer than he wanted to hear. The merchant complained, negotiated, threatened to find someone else. He listened politely and held firm. Quality work required proper time and fair payment. The merchant returned 3 days later. Another carpenter had offered to do the job for less and faster. But the insurance assessor had quietly suggested that saving money on repairs was false economy, and that this particular craftsman's work tended to last. The merchant accepted the original terms with poor grace, making it clear he expected perfection for the price. The work consumed 6 weeks. He hired 2 laborers to assist with the heavy lifting, brought in a caulker whose skill with oakum and pitch exceeded his own, consulted with a blacksmith about custom fastenings for the frame repairs. The vessel took shape beneath his hands, emerging from damage stronger than before, each joint fitted precisely, each plank selected for grain and strength. When the schooner finally slid back into the water, settling with barely a ripple, he felt the satisfaction that came from work done properly, without compromise or shortcuts. The merchant paid without comment, but the vessel's return to service spoke louder than praise. Other ship owners noticed. Commissions increased, larger projects, better rates. He hired his first regular assistant, a young man recently freed, clever with tools and quick to learn. The workshop that had felt spacious now seemed cramped, inadequate for the work flowing through. On a spring evening, walking with the provision seller along the bluff overlooking the river, he asked if she'd consider a practical arrangement. 2 businesses might support each other, he suggested. 2 people managing separate enterprises but sharing household expenses, raising her daughter together, building something more stable than either could achieve alone. She smiled at his careful phrasing, the way he framed romance as logistics. Yes, she said simply. Yes would be sensible. They married quietly that summer, a brief ceremony attended by dock workers and shop owners, people who measured worth by reliability rather than wealth. The small house they rented had a yard for a workshop expansion and rooms enough for a family. Her daughter adjusted gradually, wary at first of this man who smelled of sawdust and spoke carefully, but warming as he built her a desk for schoolwork and listened to her recitations with genuine attention. Life acquired new rhythms: morning work in the shop, midday meals together, evening accounts and planning. The small intimacies of shared domestic space. The provision business and carpentry complemented each other, her connections bringing clients, his work bringing contacts who needed supplies. They became a unit within the waterfront's complex economy, respected individually and together. The harbor continued its expansion, indifferent to individual fortunes, driven by forces larger than any single life. But within that vast mechanism, he'd carved out something solid. Work that satisfied, a household that functioned, a reputation that opened doors. The tools he'd inherited from his master hung in his expanded workshop, joined now by new acquisitions, the collection growing as his capabilities expanded. He was building something, though he couldn't yet see its full shape, only the satisfaction of each day's progress. The damage made no sense. Standing in the hold of the merchant brig, lantern light throwing shadows across the oak ribs, he traced his fingers along cuts that felt deliberate, precise, wrong in ways that defied natural explanation. Water seeped through the gashes below the waterline, not the gradual intrusion of wear and weather, but the purposeful entry that came from compromise. Captain Morris stood beside him, a weathered man who'd sailed these waters for 2 decades. "Storm damage, you think?" But his voice carried doubt even as he offered the explanation. Storm damage was chaotic, splintering wood along grain lines, crushing rather than cutting. These marks were clean, almost surgical, made by something sharp, drawn repeatedly across planking in a pattern that suggested intent rather than accident. He said nothing yet, running calculations in his mind. The angle of the cuts, the location below the waterline, the timing required to make such marks while the vessel was docked. "Could be," he offered finally, though the lie tasted bitter. "I'll need to replace 6 planks, maybe 7, reinforce the frames behind them." The repair took 4 days, working in the cramped space between cargo and hull, fitting new oak to match the vessel's curves. His assistant, the young freedman named Jacob, who'd proven invaluable over the past year, helped wrestle the heavy timbers into position. They worked mostly in silence, but Jacob paused once, running his hand along the damaged section before they covered it. "Somebody did this," he said quietly. "Didn't they?" It wasn't really a question. Jacob had grown up around the docks, had seen things that taught caution about speaking observations aloud. He simply nodded and continued working. But the words lingered in the hold's damp air, refusing to dissipate like lantern smoke. 3 weeks later, another vessel, this time a coastal schooner that hauled timber and naval stores between Savannah and ports north. Same type of damage, same inexplicable precision. The captain was furious, demanding explanations, threatening lawsuits against the shipyard where his vessel had been moored. The harbor master was summoned, peered at the damage with bureaucratic skepticism, and declared it the result of poor maintenance and shifting cargo. But it wasn't. Anyone who understood wooden vessels could see the difference between neglect and sabotage. He made the repairs, took his payment, and said nothing to contradict the official conclusion. Speaking up would mean questioning the harbor master's judgment, challenging men whose authority extended far beyond his social reach. His wife understood without explanation when he came home troubled, worked late into evening in unusual silence. The household had found its equilibrium over the years. Her daughter, his stepdaughter now, though they never used the term, was approaching womanhood, helping in the provision shop with growing competence. The business thrived, both enterprises supporting each other, money accumulating toward dreams of expansion. They'd discussed buying property, perhaps a larger building that could house both workshop and shop, consolidate their commercial presence. But the damaged vessels nagged at him like a splinter beneath the skin. 2 incidents might be coincidence. When the third occurred, a merchant sloop carrying Cotton Factor's supplies, coincidence became pattern. He began making quiet inquiries, asking dock workers what they'd noticed, which vessels had been moored nearby, whether anyone had seen unusual activity during the nights when damage occurred. The waterfront had its own social architecture, invisible to outsiders but rigid as any ship's framing. White craftsmen, black dock workers, Irish laborers, each group occupying defined spaces with carefully negotiated boundaries. He'd always maintained cordial relations across these divisions, necessary for business, natural from his own class position between merchant wealth and laboring poverty. Now those relationships became conduits for information that flowed beneath official notice. Jacob proved unexpectedly valuable. Among the dock workers, he heard things, noticed details that others dismissed. "The damage always happens around the new moon," he mentioned one afternoon while they worked on a routine repair. "Dark nights, no moon to see by." The observation was accurate. Checking back through his memory of the repairs, each had followed a moonless night. The pattern might mean nothing. Darkness aided anyone moving secretly, but patterns were worth noting, collecting, considering. His wife grew concerned as he spent evenings walking the waterfront instead of managing accounts. "This isn't your responsibility," she said one night, not quite arguing, but testing his reasoning. "You fix ships. You're not harbor watch." She was right, practically speaking. His obligation ended with quality repairs and fair prices. But something in him resisted accepting the easy boundary between craft and consequence. These vessels carried livelihoods, cargoes, lives. Someone was deliberately weakening them, risking catastrophe for reasons he couldn't yet fathom. Professional pride mixed with something deeper, a stubborn sense that witnessing wrong and doing nothing made him complicit. The tavern keeper on Factor's Walk, a shrewd Irishman named Brennan, who heard every rumor that passed through the port, poured him whiskey one evening and leaned close. "You're asking questions about the damaged ships. Careful with that. Some folks don't appreciate curiosity." "What folks?" He kept his voice neutral, casual. Brennan shrugged, wiping the bar with practiced efficiency. "Just saying. Harbor's got its own business, and not all of it welcomes inspection. You've built a good reputation. Be ashamed to complicate it." The warning was clear, even if the specifics remained vague. Someone knew he was asking questions, someone with enough influence to send messages through intermediaries. The smart response would be stopping, focusing on his workshop and family, accepting official explanations even when they contradicted evidence. But the fourth damaged vessel made that impossible. This one was a brig, owned by a merchant he'd known for years, a fair man who paid promptly and treated craftsmen with respect. The damage was worst yet, multiple gashes that had nearly sunk the vessel at dock, requiring emergency pumping and extensive repairs. Standing in that hold, watching water stream through deliberate cuts, anger overcame caution. "This has to stop," he told Jacob as they worked. "Someone needs to notify the authorities properly, present evidence they can't dismiss." Jacob looked at him with the patient expression of someone explaining obvious truths. "Who listens to us? You think the harbor master cares what a carpenter notices? And if someone powerful's involved—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The realization settled heavily. He occupied an awkward position, skilled enough to see the truth, too insignificant for his observations to matter. Speaking to authorities meant risking his reputation, possibly his business, certainly the peaceful anonymity that allowed his family to thrive. But remaining silent meant accepting that prosperity built on looking away from wrongdoing, letting harm continue because confronting it was inconvenient. His wife found him in the workshop late that night, sitting among his tools in darkness. She lit a lamp and sat beside him without speaking, waiting with the patience she'd learned through years of partnership. Finally, he spoke. "If I pursue this, there could be trouble. Powerful people might be involved. It could hurt the business, our family." She considered this seriously, not dismissing his concerns or offering false comfort. "Could people die if the damage continues? If a ship sinks at sea?" He nodded slowly. That was the calculation he couldn't avoid. Professional pride was one thing, human lives were another. "Then you'll do what you think right," she said simply. "And we'll manage whatever comes." The conversation was brief, but it settled something. He wouldn't investigate recklessly or loudly. wouldn't play at being something he wasn't. But he would watch, document, gather evidence carefully. And when he understood what was happening and who was responsible, he would find someone who could act on the information, someone whose position gave them the authority his lacked. The new moon was 10 days away. If the pattern held, another vessel would be damaged. This time, he decided, he wouldn't just repair the aftermath. He would be watching when it happened, would see with his own eyes what the darkness was hiding. The decision felt both necessary and terrifying, like stepping from solid dock onto a vessel whose seaworthiness remained uncertain. Jacob agreed to help without hesitation, though the risk for him was greater. A black man found lurking near ships at night would face assumptions a white craftsman might avoid. They planned carefully, selecting a vantage point that offered clear views of the most vulnerable berths while providing concealment. It was a small beginning, probably futile, possibly dangerous. But doing nothing had become impossible, and sometimes small beginnings were all that honor required. The ledger grew slowly, kept hidden in his workshop behind a loose board that also concealed his savings. Each damaged vessel received its own page: date, location, vessel type, cargo, ownership, repairs required. Written evidence of something he couldn't yet name, but felt increasingly certain was deliberate. Patterns emerged through documentation that memory alone might have missed. 7 vessels now, spread across 18 months. The intervals were irregular enough to suggest randomness, but the new moon correlation held perfectly. Always darkness, always below the waterline, always that same precise cutting that spoke of tools and intention. He added notes about which merchants owned the vessels, which insurance companies bore the losses, which cargoes were delayed or damaged by the incidents. Jacob brought information from corners of the waterfront he couldn't access. The black dock workers saw everything. They loaded cargo, cleaned holds, made repairs, existed in spaces where their presence went unnoticed by men conducting business. They developed their own intelligence network out of necessity, watching for dangers that official authorities rarely protected them from. "The vessels that get damaged," Jacob said one morning while they worked on replacing a rudder, "they're all insured through the same company, Seaboard Maritime Assurance." The observation was sharp, significant. Insurance was complicated business, involving assessments and premiums and payouts that could bankrupt companies or make them wealthy. If the same insurer covered all the damaged vessels, that might be coincidence. Or it might be the thread that connected everything. He visited the insurance assessor he'd worked with before, a meticulous man named Whitmore who calculated risk with mathematical precision. The conversation was careful, oblique. He mentioned noticing several repairs for vessels insured by Seaboard. Wondered if this was common or unusual. Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Interesting observation, though I'm sure just coincidence." His voice carried no conviction. Later, as he was leaving, Whitmore stepped outside briefly. "Curious minds sometimes discover uncomfortable truths. Be careful which questions you pursue visibly." Then he returned inside, the warning delivered with plausible deniability. So others had noticed. Others were watching but remaining silent. The realization was both reassuring and ominous. He wasn't imagining patterns, but those patterns led somewhere, dangerous enough that sensible men avoided following them. His household absorbed his distraction with varying degrees of patience. His stepdaughter, now old enough to understand adult concerns, if not their full implications, asked why he seemed troubled. He told her simplified truths: problems at work, complicated situations requiring thought. She accepted this with the wisdom of someone learning that adult life contained difficulties beyond immediate solution. His wife managed the provision shop with increasing independence, expanding their inventory to include specialized items that commanded higher margins. She'd become a respected merchant in her own right, known for fair dealing and reliable supply. The business provided stability that allowed him to pursue questions that generated no income, might actively threaten their prosperity. One evening she asked directly what he'd learned, what he believed was happening. He spread his documentation before her, the ledger with its careful notations, the patterns he'd identified, the connections forming between vessels and insurance and unexplained damage. She studied the pages with the same attention she gave her account books. So someone is deliberately damaging vessels insured by this company. Why? That was the question he couldn't answer. Insurance fraud seemed obvious: damage vessels, file claims, collect payments. But who profited? The ship owners received compensation but lost use of their vessels, missed shipping schedules, damaged reputations. The insurance company paid out claims, which hurt rather than helped them, unless somehow the payouts were smaller than the premiums collected, unless the pattern served some larger economic strategy he couldn't perceive. "There's another possibility," his wife said slowly. "What if someone's driving vessels away from seaboard? Making owners afraid to insure with them, forcing them toward a competing company?" The insight was elegant, plausible. If a rival insurance company wanted to eliminate competition, systematic damage to Seaboard's clients would create exactly that effect. Owners would flee to insurers whose vessels mysteriously avoided trouble. It was subtle, indirect, and utterly ruthless. He added this theory to his ledger, feeling pieces beginning to align, even as the larger picture remained obscure. But understanding motive didn't reveal perpetrators, and knowing why didn't stop the damage from continuing. The next new moon approached with the weight of obligation. He and Jacob had planned their observation carefully, selecting positions near the most likely targets, arranging signals in case they needed to alert each other across distance. It felt theatrical, overly dramatic for a carpenter and a dock worker playing at investigation. But the alternative was passive acceptance, and that had become impossible. The night was humid, heavy with the threat of rain that never arrived. They positioned themselves separately, Jacob near the newer wharves where larger vessels docked, he himself watching the older berths where coastal traders and smaller craft tied up. Hours passed in darkness, broken only by distant lanterns and the occasional watchman making rounds, too predictable to prevent anything. Near midnight, movement caught his attention. A figure moving along the dock with the confidence of someone who belonged, carrying something that could have been tools or supplies. Nothing obviously suspicious, but wrong somehow, in timing and manner. He watched as the figure descended a ladder to water level, disappearing beneath the dock between two moored vessels. His heart accelerated, despite the anticlimactic nature of the observation. This could be anything. A sailor retrieving something from his ship, a watchman checking mooring lines, a thief seeking opportunity. But it could also be exactly what he'd been seeking. And the only way to know was getting closer. Moving quietly along the dock, staying in shadows, feeling absurdly conscious of every creaking board beneath his feet. The rational part of his mind catalogued the foolishness of this. He was a carpenter, not a constable, had no authority or training for confrontation. But the compulsion to see, to know, overrode caution. From a position near the dock's edge, he could see beneath to where the figure worked. Lantern light, carefully shielded, illuminated hands wielding what looked like a specialized tool, some kind of auger or boring device, applied methodically to a vessel's hull just above the waterline. The damage was being done systematically, precisely, with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this task before. He watched, memorizing details. The tool's shape, the pattern of application, the figure's build and movement. Documenting mentally what he couldn't safely record in writing. Then the figure finished, extinguished the lantern, and moved away with the same purposeful confidence, climbing back to dock level and disappearing into darkness. Jacob found him 20 minutes later, materializing from shadows with the quiet competence that made him invaluable. "You see something?" He described what he'd witnessed. The methodical damage being inflicted while the harbor slept. Jacob nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Same thing happened at my end. Different person, though, or maybe the same one working fast. 2 vessels damaged tonight." They checked both ships as best they could in darkness, confirming fresh damage that would be discovered come morning. The scale of it was startling. 2 vessels in one night. Probably more they hadn't been positioned to observe. This wasn't occasional sabotage. This was systematic, organized, implying resources and coordination beyond casual criminality. Walking home through empty streets, he felt the weight of knowledge that couldn't yet become action. He'd witnessed the crime, but couldn't identify the perpetrator. Understood the pattern, but couldn't prove the conspiracy. Possessed information that powerful people clearly wanted suppressed. His documentation was growing more detailed, more incriminating, more dangerous. His wife was awake when he arrived, sitting at their table with account books and worry. He told her what he'd seen, the confirmation that his suspicions were accurate, the new complications this knowledge created. She listened without interrupting, then asked the practical question that cut through everything else. "What do you do now?" He didn't have a good answer. Approaching authorities meant trusting them to care more about justice than protecting commercial interests. Finding which specific merchants or insurers were responsible required resources and access he didn't possess. Continuing to investigate meant increasing risks to himself and his family. "I document everything," he said finally. "Build a case so thorough that eventually someone with power to act can't ignore it. And I try to prevent what I can, when I can, without getting killed for the effort." It was inadequate, incomplete, possibly futile. But it was what honor demanded with the limited tools available to someone of his position. She nodded acceptance, not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement that he'd made his choice and she would support it. The morning brought confirmation. 2 more damaged vessels discovered. Harbor masters conducting cursory investigations, official conclusions of accident or negligence. He made repairs, took payment, added details to his hidden ledger. And he continued watching, documenting, building evidence against the day when silence became impossible and truth demanded voices willing to speak it regardless of consequence. The tools went missing on a Thursday morning. Not all of them, just enough to notice. His best plane, 2 chisels, a specialized saw he'd commissioned from a German toolmaker. Jacob discovered the theft when opening the workshop, the door lock showing subtle signs of tampering that only careful examination revealed. "Someone's sending a message," Jacob said quietly, examining the forced lock mechanism. "Could have taken everything. Chose not to." The message was clear enough. Stop asking questions, stop watching, stop documenting patterns that powerful people preferred remained invisible. It was a warning calibrated precisely, significant enough to frighten, restrained enough to maintain deniability. Thieves struck workshops occasionally. These things happened, nothing personal. Except it was entirely personal. He stood in his violated workshop, feeling the particular violation that came from having one's tools stolen. These weren't just possessions, they were extensions of skill, instruments that had shaped his livelihood, objects that carried years of work in their worn handles and precise edges. Losing them meant more than their monetary value, though replacing them would strain finances already tight from his reduced work hours. His wife responded with practical fury when he told her. "We report this to the constable, file a complaint, make it official." But making it official meant questions about why his workshop specifically, what enemies he might have made, whether business disputes had turned hostile. Those questions would invite scrutiny he couldn't afford, might expose his investigation before he had sufficient evidence to justify it. The constables served merchant interests primarily. Reporting the theft might accomplish nothing except confirming to whoever ordered it that the message had been received and understood. "We'll replace what we must," he said finally, "and we'll be more careful." More careful meant a new lock, stronger than before. It meant bringing his documentation home, hiding it more securely. It meant varying his routines, watching for followers, checking whether conversations in taverns drew too much attention. Living with low-grade paranoia that exhausted without providing real safety. The provision shop became his wife's domain more completely as he retreated into cautious investigation. She managed inventory, handled suppliers, expanded their customer base with the same strategic intelligence she'd always possessed. Her success allowed his reduced income to remain manageable, the household staying afloat through her competence, while he pursued unprofitable truths. His stepdaughter noticed the tension, asked questions with the directness of someone old enough to deserve honest answers. He told her simplified versions, business troubles, complicated disputes, nothing she needed to worry about. She looked at him with skeptical intelligence, clearly understanding more than he acknowledged, choosing to accept the partial truth rather than press for details. The next incident was less subtle. Working late one evening, alone in the workshop after Jacob had left, he smelled smoke before seeing flames. The fire started in the corner where wood shavings accumulated despite regular sweeping. Small at first, but growing with terrifying speed among the dry timber that was his livelihood. He grabbed buckets, threw water, shouted for help that brought neighbors running with more water, more buckets, enough hands to douse the flames before they consumed the entire structure. Damage was substantial, but not catastrophic. One wall charred, supplies ruined, the acrid smell of burnt wood permeating everything. The neighbors who'd helped fight the fire offered theories: careless lamp placement, spontaneous combustion from oily rags, the kind of accidents that happened in workshops dealing with flammable materials. But it wasn't an accident. The fire had started in a corner he never used for lamps, away from any tools or materials that might generate heat. And more tellingly, it had started shortly after he'd arrived, timed to frighten rather than destroy, to send a message escalating from theft to potential violence. Jacob examined the burnt corner the next morning, found evidence confirming suspicion, traces of accelerant, signs of deliberate ignition. Neither spoke what both understood. The warnings were intensifying. Next time might be worse. Next time might target his home instead of his workshop, might threaten his family rather than just his livelihood. His wife found him sitting in the damaged workshop that evening, staring at charred timber. She sat beside him in silence, waiting for him to speak first. "I should stop," he said quietly. "This isn't worth risking you, risking our daughter, risking everything we've built." She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she spoke with the same practical directness that had first drawn him to her. "You're probably right. The sensible choice is stopping, focusing on our business, letting others handle problems too dangerous for us." She paused. "But if you stop now, whoever's doing this wins. They learn that threats work, that ordinary people can be frightened into silence. And next time it won't just be you staying quiet. It'll be everyone who sees what happened to the carpenter who asked too many questions." The logic was irrefutable and terrifying. Backing down meant safety, but also surrender, accepting that power could operate without accountability as long as it threatened sufficiently. Standing firm meant risking everything for principles that wouldn't pay his rent or feed his family. "I don't know what to do," he admitted. "I'm not brave enough to be a hero. I'm just a carpenter who noticed something wrong." "Maybe that's exactly what's needed," she said. "Not heroes, just people who notice wrong and refuse to pretend they don't see it." The conversation provided no solutions, but it clarified obligations. He would continue, but more carefully. He would gather evidence, but protect his family first. And he would find allies, people with more power than a carpenter possessed, people who might act on information he gathered. Whitmore, the insurance assessor, became such an ally, though neither acknowledged the relationship directly. Casual conversations in public places, information exchanged through careful hints, documentation passed indirectly through intermediaries. Whitmore had been tracking the damaged vessels too, had noticed patterns the official investigations ignored or concealed. He couldn't act openly without jeopardizing his position, but he could provide resources and connections a carpenter lacked. Through Whitmore, a larger picture emerged. 3 merchants controlled Seaboard Maritime Assurance, profiting from premiums while systematically undermining confidence in their own company. The damaged vessels were insured by Seaboard, but the merchants had secretly invested in a competing firm, Atlantic Commercial Insurance. Each damaged vessel drove business from Seaboard to Atlantic, enriching the very people who controlled the company being undermined. The scheme was elegant in its cynicism. The merchants collected insurance premiums through Seaboard while driving clients toward Atlantic, where they held larger stakes. When Seaboard eventually collapsed from losses and reputation damage, they'd consolidate control through Atlantic, having destroyed their own company for greater profit elsewhere. Understanding the scheme's architecture didn't immediately suggest solutions. The merchants were wealthy, politically connected, protected by networks of influence that extended through Savannah's commercial elite. Accusing them, without irrefutable proof, meant destroying his own credibility while leaving them untouched. His wife's pregnancy became apparent that autumn, unexpected but welcome despite the dangerous circumstances. She continued working through the early months, managing the shop with typical efficiency, refusing to treat pregnancy as disability. The news added urgency to everything: his investigation, his caution, his determination to create a world slightly more just for the child who would arrive come spring. Jacob's sister worked as a domestic servant in the household of one of the implicated merchants. Through her, fragments of information reached them, conversations overheard, documents glimpsed, the casual arrogance of men who believed their servants invisible and therefore safe to ignore. The intelligence was valuable, but also dangerous, placing her at risk if the source was discovered. The evidence accumulated slowly, painstakingly. Witness statements from dock workers, documentation of vessel damage, financial records showing the merchant's investments in Atlantic insurance, proof of systematic sabotage spanning nearly 2 years. It was thorough, detailed, and absolutely useless without someone willing and able to act on it. Winter brought its own complications. His wife's pregnancy advanced, her movement more limited, her energy divided between the coming child and maintaining the business. His stepdaughter took on greater responsibility in the shop, proving remarkably capable, her intelligence finding practical application in commerce and management. The workshop limped along with reduced capacity. He'd replaced some stolen tools, but couldn't afford the specialized items that had taken years to acquire. Work continued, clients still came, but the margins were thinner, the effort greater. He was tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, worn down by vigilance and worry and the weight of knowledge that demanded action while offering no clear path forward. Then Captain Morris, whose vessel had been among the first damaged, sought him out with information and a proposition. Morris had been asking his own questions, comparing notes with other captains whose ships had been targeted, building his own understanding of the pattern. And Morris had connections, relationships with harbor officials who weren't corrupt, merchants who resented the dominance of the syndicate manipulating insurance. "We can't prove this alone," Morris said, "but together, pooling what we know, we might force an official investigation that can't be suppressed." It was the opening he'd been seeking, the ally with sufficient standing to transform documentation into action. They began planning carefully, building a coalition of captains, honest insurers, merchants whose businesses suffered from the manipulation. It would take time, require patience, demand coordination across groups that rarely collaborated, but it was possible. Justice was possible. And that possibility, fragile as it was, made the risks and sacrifices feel less like futile gestures and more like necessary investments in a future slightly better than the present. His child would be born into a world still unjust, still dangerous, still weighted against ordinary people who lacked wealth and influence, but perhaps slightly less so than before. And perhaps that marginal improvement was what honor required, not grand heroism, but persistent, practical resistance to wrongs too many found it convenient to ignore. Spring arrived with his son, born on a morning when dogwoods bloomed white along the squares and the harbor bustled with vessels taking advantage of favorable winds. The birth was difficult but successful, his wife emerging exhausted and triumphant, the child small but healthy, squalling with appropriate vigor. He held his son for the first time with hands more accustomed to shaping wood than cradling life, feeling the terrifying weight of new responsibility. The household reorganized around the infant's demands. His stepdaughter proved remarkably capable with her new brother, displaying maternal instincts and practical competence beyond her years. The provision shop reduced its hours temporarily, customers understanding, business slowing but not stopping. He took on simpler repairs that allowed him to work closer to home, to be available when needed, to share the burdens that came with new life. But the investigation couldn't pause for domestic concerns. Captain Morris had assembled a coalition, 5 captains whose vessels had been damaged, 2 honest insurance assessors, a handful of merchants tired of the syndicate's dominance. They met in careful secrecy, comparing evidence, coordinating strategy, planning an approach to authorities that couldn't be easily dismissed or suppressed. The plan was straightforward in concept, complex in execution. They would catch the saboteurs in the act, document the crime with multiple witnesses, then present irrefutable evidence to officials who couldn't claim ignorance or plausible deniability. It required timing, coordination, and willingness to confront danger directly, rather than merely documenting it from safe distance. Jacob remained his primary ally in the practical work. Through the dockworkers' network, they'd identified the men doing the actual sabotage, 3 hired hands working for a 4th man who coordinated timing and targets. None were the merchants themselves, of course. Wealthy men didn't get their own hands dirty. But tracing from saboteurs to employers would become possible once the chain of evidence began. The new moon fell on a Thursday in late spring. They'd prepared carefully, positioning witnesses at multiple locations, arranging signals, coordinating with a harbor official Morris trusted to respond when summoned. It felt simultaneously like a military operation and a group of amateurs playing at detective work, the reality oscillating between competence and absurdity. He left his home that evening with his wife's worried blessing, the infant asleep, his stepdaughter understanding, without being told, the significance of the night. Walking to the waterfront in fading light, he felt the peculiar clarity that came from crossing a threshold, from moving beyond planning into irrevocable action. Jacob met him near the older wharves, accompanied by 2 dockworkers willing to serve as additional witnesses. Captain Morris and another captain positioned themselves at the northern berths. The honest harbor official, a man named Patterson who'd grown disgusted with the corruption he couldn't openly challenge, waited nearby with 2 constables he'd vetted for reliability. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. The harbor settled into its nighttime rhythms, watchmen making predictable rounds, vessels creaking at their moorings, water lapping against pilings with hypnotic monotony. Waiting felt interminable, made worse by doubt. Perhaps the saboteurs wouldn't come tonight. Perhaps they'd been warned. Perhaps This entire elaborate preparation would yield nothing but wasted effort and confirmed paranoia. Then, movement. A figure descending to water level near a merchant brig, carrying familiar tools, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed this task many times. He felt his heart accelerate, breath shortening, despite the need for quiet observation. This was the moment requiring discipline, documentation before action, patience before confrontation. A second figure appeared at a different vessel 50 yards away, then a third farther along the wharf. The operation was larger than anticipated, multiple saboteurs working simultaneously across the harbor. The coordination suggested resources and organization beyond what they'd prepared for. Jacob moved first, circling to cut off escape routes, the other dock workers positioning themselves strategically. Captain Morris emerged from concealment near the northern berths, lantern raised, voice carrying authority. "Stand where you are! You're witnessed and identified!" What followed happened with dreamlike slowness and chaotic speed simultaneously. The saboteurs ran, splitting in different directions, attempting to vanish into the darkness they'd relied on for protection. But the witnesses were positioned well, blocking obvious escape routes, forcing the fleeing men toward the center of the wharf, where Patterson and his constables waited. One saboteur, the coordinator, they'd later learn, turned to fight rather than flee. He carried a knife, brandished it with desperate aggression, clearly willing to use violence to avoid capture. The confrontation happened fast, bodies colliding in darkness, someone shouting, the knife catching lantern light as it swung toward Jacob. He moved without conscious thought, Carpenter's reflexes honed by years of physical work, translating into physical intervention. Grabbed the saboteur's arm, twisted, felt resistance and then sudden yielding as the man lost balance and fell hard against the dock edge. The knife skittered away, disappearing between planks into water below. Jacob pinned the fallen man while a constable produced restraints. The other saboteurs were captured within minutes, corralled by witnesses and constables, their escape routes blocked, their surprise at organized resistance evident in their shocked expressions. Patterson took control with bureaucratic efficiency, documenting the scene, collecting the specialized tools used for sabotage, taking statements from witnesses. The captains identified their vessels as targets, confirming the attempted crime. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, witnessed by men whose testimony would carry weight in official proceedings. But the captured saboteurs were hired labor, not principals. Getting them to identify who'd employed them required leverage, pressure, promises of reduced consequences in exchange for cooperation. Patterson conducted the initial interrogations, while dawn lightened the eastern sky, extracting reluctant admissions, building a chain of evidence that led upward through intermediaries toward the merchants who'd orchestrated everything. By morning, warrants were being prepared. The evidence was sufficient to force official action, to initiate investigations that couldn't be quietly suppressed. The merchants would fight back, certainly, hire lawyers, invoke connections, claim ignorance of their employees' actions. But the foundation had cracked. The scheme was exposed. Whatever happened next would occur in daylight rather than darkness. He walked home as the city woke, exhausted and oddly deflated despite the success. His hands ached from the brief struggle. His shoulder, where he'd impacted the dock, throbbed with developing bruises. He'd been in exactly one physical fight in his entire adult life, and it had lasted perhaps 10 seconds before others intervened. The anticlimactic nature of it felt somehow appropriate. Justice wasn't heroic combat. It was mundane documentation and bureaucratic process, punctuated by brief moments of chaos. His wife was awake, nursing the infant, worry evident in her expression until she saw him whole and unharmed. He told her everything: the successful trap, the captures, the evidence now in official hands. She listened, relief and residual fear mixing in her response. "Is it over then?" she asked. He considered carefully. "This part is. What happens next, the trials, the political maneuvering, the consequences, that's beyond what we can control. But we did what was needed. Gathered the evidence, forced it into light. The rest is up to others." His stepdaughter appeared, having heard his voice, wanting confirmation that he was safe. He assured her, sent her back to sleep, then sat at the table with his wife in the pre-dawn quiet. The infant nursed contentedly, oblivious to the night's events, to the risks his father had taken before he was old enough to understand or remember. Captain Morris visited later that day, bringing news and gratitude. The merchants had been formally accused, their investments in Atlantic Insurance exposed, their scheme detailed in warrants that read like indictments of systemic corruption. There would be legal proceedings, certainly drawn out, probably contentious, but the facts were established, the witnesses numerous, the documentation thorough. "You should know," Morris said quietly, "there will be retaliation. Not physical, probably. Not now that everything's public. But social consequences, business pressure, the kind of subtle punishment powerful men inflict on those who challenge them." He nodded, understanding. Some merchants would refuse his services, would spread rumors about his reliability or competence, would make his professional life more difficult through invisible mechanisms of class solidarity. It was the price of speaking truth inconvenient to power, and he'd accepted that cost when he chose investigation over silence. But there would be support, too. Captains whose vessels he'd helped protect, honest merchants who respected integrity, customers who valued skill over political convenience. His reputation had always rested on quality work and fair dealing. That foundation wouldn't disappear because wealthy criminals disliked him. Jacob suffered worse consequences. 2 days after the arrests, he was dismissed from the positions he'd held with various shipping companies. No explanations given, no reasons stated, just sudden unemployment that was clearly coordinated retaliation. The message was brutal in its clarity. Black men who challenged white power would be made examples of, would suffer consequences designed to discourage future resistance. He offered Jacob work in his own shop, regular employment at fair wages. It was inadequate compensation for what Jacob had risked and lost, but it was what he could provide. Jacob accepted with quiet dignity, understanding that some victories came with costs distributed unequally, that justice was always partial, always complicated by the realities of power and position. The household settled into new routines, shaped by the infant's needs and the investigation's aftermath. Work continued, income reduced but manageable, the provision shop thriving under his wife's management. They'd survive the crisis, preserve their integrity, contributed to exposing corruption that had threatened the entire harbor's prosperity. It wasn't triumph, exactly. Too much remained unjust. Too many complications persisted. Too many consequences fell on those least able to bear them. But it was something. A small victory, a marginal improvement, a demonstration that ordinary people could challenge extraordinary power, and sometimes, with luck and courage and coalition, could force accountability where none had existed before. The courthouse smelled of old wood and newer anxieties, tobacco smoke and nervous sweat mixing in air that never quite circulated properly. He sat in the witness gallery, watching lawyers perform their elaborate dances of argument and objection, feeling profoundly out of place among men whose power came from words rather than hands. The trial had taken months to reach this point. Delays and continuations, motions and countermotions, the legal machinery grinding slowly through procedures designed as much to exhaust as to illuminate. The three merchants sat at the defense table with expressions of offended dignity, as if the accusations themselves constituted unforgivable breach of social order. Their lawyers were expensive, eloquent, skilled at transforming clear evidence into murky ambiguity. They suggested the saboteurs had acted independently, pursuing personal grudges. They questioned the credibility of witnesses, dock workers with criminal records, captains with business disputes, a carpenter with suspiciously detailed documentation that might indicate obsession rather than observation. But the prosecution had Patterson, whose bureaucratic thoroughness had created a paper trail impossible to dismiss. They had the captured saboteurs, two of whom had agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. They had financial records showing the merchants' investments in Atlantic Insurance, documents proving they profited from Seaboard's decline. The case was solid, built on facts rather than speculation, evidence rather than theory. He was called to testify on the trial's fourth day. Walking to the witness stand felt like crossing vast distance, every eye in the courtroom tracking his movement, judging his credibility before he spoke a word. The oath was administered, his hand on a Bible worn smooth by countless previous witnesses, his voice steadier than he felt. The prosecution led him through his testimony methodically, his profession, his expertise in ship repair, his growing awareness of the damage pattern, his documentation of the incidents. He spoke carefully, sticking to observable facts, avoiding speculation or emotional appeals. This was his strength, not rhetoric, but precision, the same attention to detail that made him good at his craft. The defense attorney approached cross-examination with barely concealed contempt. "You're a carpenter, not an investigator. What qualifies you to draw conclusions about complex commercial matters?" "I draw conclusions about wood and water and structural integrity. Those damaged vessels came through my workshop. I documented what I saw." Documented obsessively, some might say. Tell me, do you often spend your evenings watching the harbor instead of attending to your family? The question was designed to paint him as unstable, overly invested in matters beyond his station. He kept his voice level. "I spent my evenings investigating crimes that threatened people's livelihoods and lives. My family understood the necessity." The cross-examination continued, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting alternative explanations, attempting to undermine his credibility through insinuation. But the facts remained stubborn. The damage was real. The pattern was documented. The sabotage was witnessed by multiple people whose accounts corroborated each other. Captain Morris testified with the authority of 30 years at sea, his weather-worn credibility impossible to dismiss. Jacob testified despite obvious discomfort under the defense's hostile questioning, his simple honesty more powerful than any elaborate rhetoric. Whitmore presented insurance records with actuarial precision, demonstrating the financial mechanisms that made the scheme profitable. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury, 12 merchants and property owners, men whose class position might have inclined them toward sympathy with the accused, deliberated for 3 days. The wait was excruciating, filled with second-guessing and what-if scenarios, awareness that justice was never guaranteed, that wealth and connections often outweighed evidence. The verdict came on a humid afternoon. Guilty on multiple counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of property, corruption of public officials. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, the defendants' faces showing shock that their status hadn't protected them, that mere craftsmen and sailors and clerks could actually hold them accountable. Sentencing followed a week later. Prison terms, substantial fines, dissolution of their business interests in maritime insurance. The punishment was significant, though not ruinous. Wealthy men had resources to rebuild, connections to rehabilitate their reputations eventually. But the precedent mattered. The message was sent that even powerful merchants could face consequences for criminal behavior. Walking out of the courthouse after sentencing, he felt neither triumph nor celebration. Relief, certainly. Satisfaction that the months of effort had produced tangible results. But also awareness of how much remained unchanged, how partial this victory was, how many similar schemes probably operated unchallenged across the city and beyond. Captain Morris found him on the courthouse steps, offered a handshake that conveyed more than words. "You did something important. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But the costs were real and accumulating. His client base had indeed shrunk, some merchants unwilling to employ someone who'd testified against his betters. The workshop survived, but didn't thrive, work coming steadily but not abundantly. He'd developed a reputation for integrity that attracted certain clients while repelling others, a mixed blessing that required careful financial management. Jacob's situation improved slightly. The trial's outcome vindicated his testimony, made his dismissal look like obvious retaliation rather than legitimate cause. Some employers approached him quietly, offering work that acknowledged his skills, while avoiding public association that might draw criticism. It was incremental progress, inadequate, but better than nothing. The harbor changed subtly in the trial's aftermath. Insurance practices came under greater scrutiny. Reforms were proposed. Captains felt more comfortable reporting suspicious incidents. The immediate scheme was stopped, but, more importantly, the possibility of accountability had been demonstrated. That possibility, fragile as it remained, altered calculations, made potential criminals slightly more cautious, created space for honest competition. His household absorbed the trial's disruptions and returned to something approaching normalcy. His son grew with the oblivious contentment of infancy. His stepdaughter continued managing the provision shop with remarkable competence. His wife balanced motherhood and commerce with the practical efficiency that had always defined her approach to life's demands. But there were consequences he hadn't anticipated. Some customers who'd frequented the provision shop stopped coming, their loyalty to merchant-class solidarity outweighing their appreciation for quality goods and fair prices. His wife handled these small betrayals with philosophical acceptance, replacing lost business with new customers who valued integrity over social conformity. His stepdaughter proved unexpectedly affected by the trial's publicity. Some families forbid their daughters from associating with her, as if testifying against corruption was somehow disreputable, more shameful than the corruption itself. She bore this with mature grace, but he saw the hurt beneath her composure, the cost extracted from someone who'd done nothing wrong except being related to him. These consequences bothered him more than the professional costs. He'd chosen investigation knowing the risks, accepted them as part of pursuing justice. But his family hadn't chosen this, had simply supported his decisions, and now paid their own prices. The guilt was substantial, though his wife dismissed his apologies. "We did the right thing," she said firmly. "People who abandon us over that were never truly friends. We'll be fine." And they were fine. Mostly. Income was reduced, but adequate. Work continued. The workshop productive, if not prosperous. The provision shop adapted, found new customers, maintained profitability through his wife's strategic management. They'd survived the crisis, preserved their values, demonstrated that ordinary people could resist extraordinary pressure without being destroyed by it. Months after the trial concluded, Patterson sought him out at the workshop. The harbor official looked worn, as if the fight had extracted its own toll from him. "Wanted you to know, reforms are being implemented. New oversight for insurance practices, regular inspections of docked vessels, procedures for reporting suspicious damage. It's not revolutionary, but it's something." Reform was always incremental, always partial, always compromised by the same power structures that necessitated it in the first place. But incremental improvement was still improvement, and dismissing it as insufficient meant abandoning any hope of progress. He thanked Patterson, understanding that bureaucratic courage was its own kind of bravery, that people working within corrupt systems to make them slightly less corrupt deserved recognition, even if their victories seemed modest. The anniversary of that first damaged vessel passed almost unnoticed. Nearly 2 years since he'd first encountered the mysterious cuts that had launched this entire ordeal. 2 years of investigation and risk and consequence, resulting in convictions and reforms and small hard-won changes. It felt simultaneously momentous and anticlimactic, profound and mundane, exactly like most real victories that happened outside dramatic narratives. His son took his first steps that autumn, wobbling across the floor with determined concentration, falling and rising and trying again with the persistence that characterized all learning. Watching him, he felt the familiar mix of hope and worry that defined parenthood. Hope that the world his son inherited might be slightly better than the one he'd known. Worry that improvement would always be too slow, too partial, too vulnerable to reversal. But improvement was possible. He'd proven that, along with Captain Morris and Jacob and Patterson and all the others who'd chosen resistance over resignation. The proof was modest. 1 scheme exposed, 3 criminals convicted, some reforms implemented. But modest proof was still proof, and sometimes that had to be enough. Not satisfaction exactly, but something close enough to sustain the ongoing work of living honestly in a dishonest world, of building small integrities that might cumulatively construct something larger than their individual pieces suggested. The apprentice arrived on a morning when fog rolled thick off the river, softening the city's edges into suggestion rather than certainty. A boy of perhaps 10, brought by his mother who worked in one of the Factor's Walk warehouses, her request careful and hopeful in equal measure. Could he possibly take on an apprentice? Her son was good with his hands, eager to learn a trade that might lift him beyond day labor. He looked at the boy, thin, watchful, hands already calloused from whatever work children did to help their families survive, and saw himself decades earlier. The same hunger to learn, the same awareness that skilled labor was the only ladder available to people born without wealth or connections. He agreed to a trial period, terms negotiated carefully, remembering how his own mother had sacrificed to secure his apprenticeship. The workshop had stabilized over the past year. Work came steadily from captains who valued quality, honest merchants who preferred competence to social conformity, insurance companies that remembered how his testimony had saved them substantial losses. It wasn't the prosperity he'd once imagined, but it was sufficient, sustainable, honest, in ways that mattered more than he'd understood when younger. Jacob had become more partner than employee, his expertise in certain repairs exceeding what could be taught, his judgment trusted without question. They'd developed the wordless communication that came from years working together, each anticipating the other's movements, compensating for weaknesses, amplifying strengths. The racial divide that Savannah's society insisted on felt irrelevant in the workshop, though they were both careful about maintaining proper appearances outside its walls. His son had grown into energetic toddlerhood, exploring the workshop with fascination and alarming fearlessness. He'd learned early to recognize different woods by smell, could identify oak versus pine versus cedar before he could properly pronounce their names. Whether he'd follow his father's trade remained uncertain, but the exposure felt important, understanding that objects were made by human hands, that skill had value, that work could be a source of dignity rather than just necessity. His stepdaughter had surprised everyone, including herself, by developing a talent for business strategy that exceeded simple shop management. She'd expanded the provision business into new areas, established relationships with suppliers that improved margins, identified market opportunities that others missed. At 17, she managed aspects of the enterprise that would have overwhelmed him, her natural aptitude for commerce finding expression in ways his wife encouraged enthusiastically. The household had become more complicated as it grew more stable. His wife's mother had moved in, after an injury left her unable to manage alone, adding another person to feed and care for, but also another pair of hands for childcare and household management. The small house they'd rented for years was purchased finally, scraped together savings, and a loan from Captain Morris making ownership possible. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs, secured against the uncertainties that defined working-class life. The harbor continued its expansion, though the character of growth had shifted. Cotton still flowed through in enormous quantities, but new industries were emerging: naval stores, lumber, manufactured goods heading south from northern factories. The vessels themselves were changing, steamships becoming more common, their mechanical reliability challenging the romance of sail. Progress was relentless, indifferent to nostalgia, reshaping the waterfront in ways both exciting and melancholic. He'd developed a reputation among certain circles as someone who could be trusted with difficult repairs and uncomfortable truths. Captains occasionally sought his opinion on vessels they were considering purchasing. Insurance assessors consulted him about damage claims. Harbor officials asked for input on proposed regulations. This informal expertise provided no official status or additional income, but it offered something perhaps more valuable: recognition that his judgment mattered, that years of observation and experience had created knowledge worth consulting. The apprentice learned quickly, absorbing lessons with the intensity of someone who understood opportunities' fragility. He taught as he'd been taught, through demonstration more than explanation, letting the work itself communicate principles that words couldn't capture. The boy made mistakes, of course, ruined materials, misjudged measurements, struggled with techniques that seemed simple once mastered. But he persisted, showing the fundamental requirement that mattered more than initial talent: unwillingness to quit when work became difficult. Teaching forced him to articulate knowledge he'd internalized so completely that conscious thought was no longer required. Why this joint rather than that one? How did you know the timber would split? What made one repair last while another failed? The questions revealed depths beneath skill, understanding that had accumulated gradually, almost invisibly, across decades of practice. Passing this knowledge forward felt like obligation and gift simultaneously. Continuation of the chain that connected him to his master to the generation before, back through time to craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose techniques persisted. Jacob had begun teaching too, taking the apprentice for certain tasks, demonstrating approaches that differed from his own methods, showing the boy that expertise could take multiple forms. The apprentice learned more from watching two skilled craftsmen debate the best approach to a repair than from any single instruction, understanding that even within a trade there were choices, preferences, styles that reflected individual judgment. Evenings acquired new rhythms. After the workshop closed and supper ended, he'd sit with his son, teaching letters and numbers, telling stories about ships and voyages, pointing out constellations visible above the city's lights. His stepdaughter would review accounts, while his wife mended clothes or managed correspondence with suppliers. The domestic scene was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of peaceful routine that had seemed impossible during the investigation's dangerous months. But there were reminders. Walking past the courthouse, he'd sometimes see one of the convicted merchants, released after serving reduced sentences, rebuilding commercial interests with the resilience of wealth. They'd look through him as if he didn't exist, social erasure being the last revenge available to them. He found he didn't care particularly. Their opinion had never mattered. Their acknowledgement was never necessary. Their world and his intersected only at those moments when injustice became too blatant to ignore. Captain Morris remained a friend, their relationship transcending the business arrangements that had brought them together. They'd meet occasionally at Brennan's Tavern, talking about harbor politics and vessel design, and the slow changes reshaping Savannah. Morris was aging visibly now, his last years at sea approaching, his thoughts turning toward whatever came after a life defined by maritime commerce. "You ever regret it?" Morris asked one evening. "The investigation, the trial, all the trouble it brought." He considered carefully. Regret was complicated, layered. He regretted the costs to his family, the opportunities lost, the friendships damaged. But did he regret exposing the scheme, forcing accountability, demonstrating that resistance was possible? That question answered itself. No, he said simply. Couldn't live with staying silent. Morris nodded, understanding. That's the thing about integrity. Can't be selective about it. Either you have it or you don't. And if you have it, sometimes it costs more than you'd prefer. The observation was accurate and slightly depressing. Integrity should be rewarded, should create advantages rather than obstacles. But the world didn't work that way, particularly for people without wealth or power. Integrity was its own reward, which was noble in theory and occasionally frustrating in practice. His son turned 3 that spring, celebrated with a small gathering of family and friends, the kind of modest festivity that marked working-class milestones. Watching the child play with other children, he felt the familiar weight of hope, that this boy's life might contain more choices than his own had, that the world might bend slightly more toward justice, that the small victories accumulated across years might compound into something larger. The apprentice was progressing well, ready to move beyond basic tasks into more substantial work. He'd built his first toolbox, collected his initial tools, begun developing the craftsman's relationship with instruments that extended capability beyond mere flesh. There was satisfaction in witnessing this transformation, seeing skill emerge from repetition and instruction, watching the boy discover that his hands could create things of value and beauty. One afternoon, working on a particularly complex repair, the apprentice asked why he'd become a carpenter rather than pursuing other trades. The question was innocent, curious, but it prompted reflection on choices that hadn't really felt like choices, paths that circumstances and opportunity had defined, more than deliberate decision. "My mother found me an apprenticeship," he said finally. "I learned the work and discovered I was good at it. Sometimes that's how life happens, not through grand plans, but through incremental steps that accumulate into a path." The answer seemed to satisfy the boy, or at least gave him something to think about. But it also satisfied something in himself, the recognition that his life, for all its detours and complications, had followed a trajectory that made sense in retrospect, even if it had felt uncertain while living through it. Evening descended with the gentle insistence of spring turning toward summer. The workshop smelled of fresh shavings and honest work, tools cleaned and resting in their proper places, projects organized for tomorrow's continuation. Walking home through streets he'd known for decades, he felt the contentment that came from exhaustion earned through meaningful labor. His wife was nursing their second child, a daughter born the previous winter when he arrived. His stepdaughter was reviewing ledgers at the table. His son was attempting to build something with wooden blocks, his tongue protruding slightly in concentration. The domestic scene was unremarkable, ordinary, precisely the kind of peaceful routine that people sometimes failed to recognize as blessing until it was threatened or lost. They'd survived. More than survived, they'd built something, preserved their values, raised children who understood that integrity mattered more than convenience. The world remained unjust in countless ways. Power still corrupted. Wealth still insulated people from consequences they richly deserved. But within his small sphere of influence, he'd done what honor required, had chosen difficulty over ease, principle over profit, resistance over resignation. "The grain endures," his old master used to say. Wood remembers everything, the careful cuts and careless ones, the patient work and rushed jobs, the respect or disregard shown to its nature. People were the same way. Choices accumulated, character formed through thousands of small decisions, integrity built like a vessel from individual pieces joined carefully over time. His life had been one of modest achievement, a skilled craftsman, decent husband, adequate father, reluctant investigator who'd stumbled into exposing corruption. Nothing heroic or exceptional, just ordinary persistence, the refusal to accept that injustice had to be tolerated, the stubborn belief that small actions mattered even when their effects remained invisible. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more small decisions that collectively defined who he was and what he stood for. But tonight there was this: family, home, the satisfaction of work well done, the quiet knowledge that he'd lived according to principles worth preserving. The future remained uncertain, always would be. But he'd given his children tools beyond those hanging in his workshop, examples of how to move through an imperfect world without becoming complicit in its worst impulses, how to build lives of meaning from materials no more exotic than skill and persistence and care. The lamp burned steadily on the table. His daughter nursed contentedly. His son's block tower collapsed and was immediately rebuilt with undiminished determination. Outside, the harbor rested between tides, vessels waiting for dawn and departure, the endless cycle of arrival and leaving that defined port cities and human lives alike. He was part of that cycle, had been from birth, would be until death. But he'd shaped his portion of it deliberately, carved meaning from circumstance, left marks that might endure beyond his years like good joinery in a well-built ship. That was enough. Perhaps it had to be.